There we go. Sheesh. Finally. Okay. Now we should have audio through the headset mic. Now if I mute that, I should not be listening to myself with an echo. And hopefully you guys have good audio. All right. Well, now that the stream's, 20 minutes into it, we've got audio sorted out. It's been a while since I've used OBS, guys. Sorry. So I'm printing the last of this roll of filament, just making leg ends. Let's see here. Get the right file. And we'll print some of those. Okay, so we've got the soldering iron heating up at the workbench over here. I've got my Fast Tracks number 6 jig all set up. Got my little piece of sandpaper. I'm going to sand off the bottom of the frog here just to make sure it's prepped and ready for solder. And I have pre-bent my points. You definitely want to do that when you're doing these jig built turnouts, just to get it close. They don't have to be exact, but one thing you don't want to do is have a straight piece and then force it into the jig and solder it down. And because if you do, you're creating a lot of stress, and that thing's going to pop out of alignment or come loose or whatever. And then up here I have taped up a whole bunch of pre-cut and gapped. I did this weeks ago. Pre-cut and gapped all the ties. And so now it's time to get them out and put them in the jig, in the fixture. So I'm not watching the chat, but I will get up and when I stretch my legs and go check it out. So type stuff if you are listening or will have a question, and I will get over there after a little bit and check out what's going on. But for right now, I'm going to get these guys into the fixture. And when I lay these out, I try to lay them so that when I filed the little gaps, the isolation gaps, I put them in the same way that I laid them out. So you should see that where's my little knife? So there's a little gap right there, right at the split where the diverging tracks and the through tracks come together. And it should line up. You gotta pay attention to that when you're taking them off and putting them in here. Make sure I get them right side up. And like that, they make sure that the gaps line up where they're supposed to be. Now, one other thing I usually do is, well, I sand the bottom of the rails, make sure everything's completely deburred. Don't want any little things to hang up. I pre-sand and file the ends of the ties so that that's all good to go. And I do these a little bit differently than most guys do because I start with the frog. So let's get our solder and our flux out here. And I also use a paste flux. This is just, it's probably getting close to being done with this. This is probably a 10-year-old jar of paste flux from Radio Shack. Is that even a thing anymore? So we're gonna put some on there at every little spot, and I will probably end up applying more of this as I get going here, because as soon as you heat up a joint, it melts and flows everywhere, and you always want a little bit on the joint to be able to flow in and help the solder spread. It just cleans the joint up. It makes it nice and strong. So, kind of wiping it off, trying to keep it down towards the tip, not get it built up so much on the side of the tool. And this is just an old worn out micro brush that I'm spreading this stuff with. At one point in time it had little bristles on it, but I've used it quite a lot and the bristles are all gone, but that's okay. Works fine for spreading flux. Oh, I know, I saw that one. I missed that one right there. And after you build a few turnouts, because I get this paste flux everywhere, I take a toothbrush with some Dawn, hit it with some alcohol, rubbing alcohol, and kind of dissolve because what this is flux dissolved in Vaseline kind of a thing as a carrier. Um, so then I'll clean all that up and get it so that it's not so goopy. But right now it kind of helps to have a little bit of goop because it kind of sticks the ties down in there. So I've got kind of a dirty tip. So what I have is I went to the store and bought a bunch of these copper scouring pads, and I just happened to have an old film canister. Film? What is that? Nobody uses film anymore. But from high school days, we used to get film and in photography class, develop our stuff, and this is an Ilford HP4 canister, and just stuffed my pads in there, and then you can stick it in there and polish up your tip, clean it off. Now that's an old tip. So once I've done that and cleaned all that off, I will take it and zap it a little bit in the flux, and then I have a little container with a damp sponge. I'll just clean that up, get all the flux off, and then we'll touch it to, and you're going to get some smoke in your eyes there, to the solder and pre-tin it. So what I'm going to start with first is, oops, the frog, and I'm pushing it down into you can't push out here because that tips the rails up and pulls it away from here, so you have to keep the pressure here. But what you want to do is work the rails until you feel it drop into the guides on the fixture, and then I push it as far as I can this direction. You know, you don't want to force the rails apart, but I want the point end of it to be as far back as I possibly can get it. Now this is where you have to have, soldering fingers. So I'm holding it, make sure I touch the rail, and then touch the touch the tie at the same time. And I'm not going to solder out here by the point of the frog because there's guardrails that go in there later. Whoops. And that would not be good. Don't lose your Don't lose your ties, all covered with goop. Okay, so do both sides and do all 4 of these little ties right here. And try not to get too much solder built up on the inside. You can always go at it with a file and clean it out, but it's best not to have that. It's best to have a nice clean looking joint with minimal solder climbing up the rail. But you do want to make sure that the solder flows underneath the rail. Then before we put this back, we'll wipe that down. Okay, so the frog's in there. Next up, I have the straight stock rail, and it has a notch carved out of it using the stockade tools, which get rid of my alcohol there. So the Fast Track stockade tool, you put it in there and you file away the base of the rail so that the points can snuggle in next to this piece of rail. And then, so I hope you guys can see all this. So right here there's a little milled mark for the point to nestle into, and I put the notch of the stock rail just beyond that little point. So now I'm going to guide the rail into this little groove, and it may not stay exactly right now, but we're going to do the same thing. So I just turn my solder up so I can touch the end of it, get a little bit of solder, and let it flow underneath. And I'm going to do these 2. Okay, and then I'm not going to do where the guardrails go, but I am going to do this one right here. And I'm also making sure that I keep the rail, so inside these little slots, there is a bit of play, and I tried to straighten this rail out as best I could before I started, but up here where I filed the notch, you can see I can kind of move it, so I keep this pulled over towards the outside. And I'm going to solder all of these connections right here. So I just work my way down, and it's just the tiniest touch of solder, and let it flow under. And again, pulling the rail towards the outside edge of the fixture. Okay. Make sure it flows on top of there. All right. So want to make sure everything stays flat down in the fixture. So then I'm going to do the same thing with the diverging stock rail. Now this one, same thing. I'm going to have the notch start there. I like to make sure everything goes down into the little guide. And again, don't push out here because that will force the rail up, and we want it to stay down. So we just make that stick up in the air and come at it like so. Little dash. Nope, it did not flow. Make sure you touch the rail. You would like it to climb. You can't really put the soldering iron across it this way because it won't. The ties are a little bit below the top of the fixture plate, And since this is aluminum, it'll just wick the heat right away from the soldering iron tip. So you've got to kind of put it down in there. This is a 25-watt iron, which is about right for doing this kind of track work for N scale. And the other thing is you don't want to get the tops of the PC ties too hot, because you can delaminate the PC clad material from the tie, the fiberglass tie part itself. So you want to kind of heat the rail a little more than you heat the top of the tie. Okay, now getting to this part. Again, making sure that I push this towards the outside of its little groove there. Okay, and I do, again, things a little bit differently. I'm not putting the throw bars in until I get ready to mount these. So I will put the points in and do everything else, and the throw bars are the last thing. I'll solder all my feeder wires, cut all my isolation gaps and everything else. Throw bars the last thing that I put in, and that happens after it gets mounted. And the reason for doing that is to make sure that I've got the throw bar rod hole, you know, for the wire that comes up through there, in the right place. So lining up the point, I don't want to push it all the way up against that notch. I want to bring it back just a tiny amount. And then on the fixture, we'll just line that up. There is, you can barely see them here, there's a little milled mark where that is where you make your notch for bending the guardrail. What are we calling that? Well, it's not the point, it's the point rail, but it forms the guardrail with on the frog. So I'm lining up the corner of my square file with the side that I'm going to notch, and the brass is really soft, so I can just super light pressure and just run this up and down a little bit and make my notch, and try not to cut into the top of the rail at all, and also make sure that you deburr the bottom. Don't push up a burr and then just leave it there, because that will ruin your track work. It may not do it right away, but eventually, yes, you will have something that will catch. And then we're going to just bend that a little bit. And I have a nice set of smooth jaw square nose pliers that I got. These are Craftsman's eons ago, but they don't have any serrations, so they're not going to screw up the brass. And I went a little too far, so we can straighten that out a bit. Kind of put it in place. Okay, that looks reasonable. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is snip this off. And so we'll make a little mark here. On the top of the rail. Get my little rail nippers. The flush cutting side, goes towards the rail I want to keep. Line it up on my mark, and you can go a little bit beyond the mark. Snip it off. Maintain control of that so it doesn't go flying all over the place. And once we're done with that, always square up the end. And that doesn't take very much. Deburr the bottom. because I guarantee you it will have a little bit of a burr. Deburr the top flange, and the reason you do the top flange is, and the top of the rail and all of that sort of stuff, is think about once this thing's together and you're rubbing your track cleaner down the track, you don't want a burr or a sharp edge that's going to hang up on, and then it tears up your turnout just trying to clean the track. So again, neatness counts, and deburr everything. So now we may need a little more flux because some of these are kind of close to where I was. And you'll see here there's an H and an S. The H means that is the hinged, if we were building these with hinges, that is where the end of the solid rail would get soldered to, and then the hinge would stick out past that. But the S is for solid rail points. So that's the last one we're going to solder, is right there. So we'll get a little bit more flux. Come on. And you do want to do this in a ventilated room. Don't eat after you've spread flux. Don't rub your eyes. Yada, yada, yada. All the things you should not do with chemicals apply to flux. So we're going to put this in here. Make sure that's lined up. Push the... Oops, I forgot one step. Before we push that in there, we got to make the little bevel, because they always have a little bevel right on the end of the rail. And in N scale, I mean, you can add a little bit of a bend to it. I haven't been, and these are going to be yard tracks, and there's a bunch of them. So I'm not necessarily doing that to all of them. Okay, so you put that in there and double check with your flange or your gauge. You can only check one side, but that's our flange way right there. I'm going to put a dash of flux on the outsides of this rail, because I'm going to solder from this side, and on top of this point of the frog. Okay, so now we're going to make that stand up there again so I can get a hold of it. Give it a little wipe with the sponge. Tiny little dab, and we're going to solder that one right there. Hold that till it cools. Another little dab. I'm going to put this one right here. Okay, that's holding that pretty good. And I'm still not going to solder those quite yet, but they're good. So we're going to finish up the other point and guardrails setup before we solder that. Now this one's straight, so it's not quite as big a deal, but like I said, pre-bend everything and do all the work you can before you start soldering. Okay, make my little mark. I can barely see that, but I can see it. Okay, there's the little mark. Now we're going to cut our notch on that side. Okay. That. Whoops, that's the wrong ones. Right here. Little bit of a bend. Needs to go a smidge more. That's about right. Okay. These little pieces will become our guardrails eventually. Yeah, I know, I've got a mess here. I should probably clean up. So these are the turnouts I built yesterday. There's a number 7 that still needs to be cleaned up. So we'll stick them up there. Square it up. Deeper. Deeper. Okay, a little notch on the corner, little angle. I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but that's all it takes. Just about 4 or 5 swipes with the file. Put that in there. Make sure we're pushed down in, and that. Yeah, so when we get to soldering that, so this side will be pushed out and this side will be pushed out. So right now we're going to just a little touch here. Boop. Okay. And okay. So yeah, you don't want to solder down any further than that S1 because these are the hinges. Now right now they're tied into the fixture, but believe me, they will move back up in this area once we get all done. So now we've got this and that done. We've got enough flux on there. I'm going to hold that over with a knife and push down on the frog point at the same time and push down and out on that all at the same time. I don't want to push the frog out of alignment, but I would like to reflow the solder. There we go. I can see it. Nope. We may have to add a little more flux and a little more solder to that. So what we're trying to do is get the flux to flow down around this and reflow solder down inside the frog to bond that frog point to the tie, because right now it's not soldered at all. So we're going to hold that. Push down on that. Hold that. Nope, it's still moving. So we're going to hit this with a little more solder. Just a little bit, and then hold it with the knife while it sets up. Okay. And that is tight. Okay. Now, last couple pieces are these little guards that go in here. Oops. Tweezers always handy to have around. A couple of toothpicks are handy to have around. So let's cut that to length. So I'm going to file the end of it. So I'm going to cut it just a smidge long. And we're going to make both of these the same length because what the heck, why not? They're close enough. And that's, once I file that, I think it's going to be close enough. So it worked out just perfect. So let's see. File this. Got a fly flying around in here. Go away. Silly bugs. Okay. Well, you're going to die during the winter time. I hate to tell you that, Mr. Fly. Okay, I may have to go all nuclear on a fly here in just a minute. So let me mute, and you may see things flying across the room because he's bugging the heck out of me. All right. So these, the guards, so this is the length that you're supposed to cut your guards, but in order to use that, you can't you got to have them pre-cut, and I like using the little pieces of scrap rail to do it. So I couldn't get a cutter in there, so I just do it by eye, laying it out here on the top of that. And then these little angles right here are for bending these guardrail pieces. Um, I don't use those either, just because I think they're a little too much. I don't think they need to be that long or that big of a deflection. But you can see, oops, well, here's one I did, and this end has a little bit of a bend, a little bit of a bend, a little bit of a bend. That was done with the using this part. This one has really no bend at all. It's just got the angles filed on it. And I don't think they look that bad. Like I said, these are going to be yard tracks. They're not going to be mainline tracks, so everything's going to be slow speed going through here. It's not going to cause any problems operationally. So, and I think they look just as good. But you're free to disagree with me. But as I'm the only one building hand-built turnouts in our group, this is the way I build them. Okay, so now we're going to put the little bevel. Let's make sure that fits first. Make sure that's the right length. So yeah, that'll be fine for there. And this one should be really close to the same length. They look really, really good. Okay. So I just pick. So what I try to do is pick an angle, a long angle, and then put the file about 45 degrees to the side, roughly, and oh, the fly's landing on my head. So I want the angle not quite to go all the way across the rail, and just eyeball it. Probably be 3 times the rail head, maybe twice the rail head width in length is what you're shooting for. And basically it's just a little easement. If somehow between pushing and pulling, especially with truck mounted couplers, you might get some slack action and twisting on the trucks. You don't want them popping off the track because they smack into the guardrails. So this just kind of helps ease the wheel into the guardrail and keeps things from hanging up on it. Okay, so it goes in this way, but before we do that, we're going to put a little dab more just to make sure we've got some flux in there. Get it on the tie. Whoa, a little too much. And a little bit over there. A little bit on the side of the rail, and on the tie, and on the side of the rail. Okay, so we've got guardrail, inside, outside here, all 4. Okay, so we've got those spots to solder, and that's the last we've got to solder. So I'll put this in place, and this time I'll use my tweezers. And a nice set of locking tweezers is good to have, although this one set, I've disabled the lock. So I want to make sure that it's pushed in on this side. I'll hold that with my fingernail. Get a drop of solder. There we go. There we go. You can see when it wicks in there. Okay, same thing here. Hold it out. Okay. All right. There's that side. I'm gonna get him. You guys have money on it. When the fly bites it, okay? All right. So now same thing. Push it in this way. Get my solder. Okay. Clean off our tip. Put our iron away. I'm going to plug the iron for right now because it's time for a little break. Double check my work. Make sure I've got all the ties. So go down this side. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, 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 yes. In there. Frog. Everything else. So now the gap right here, I can see my tie was a little bit out of position. I may end up going back in and cleaning that out or cutting that gap a little wider. But there's a turnout. Just that easy. So thanks for joining me. I only got about 10 or 12 more to do. So time to get up, stretch your legs, and take a little break. And the prints should be It's almost done. Let's see if there's anybody in chat. Nope. Okay. Groovy beans. All right. Well, I will see you guys in the next one.